Welcome back, everybody. Panelists, participants of the conference, also viewer participants, to the conference on global Islamophobia in an era of populism. This is the third session entitled Islamophobia in Europe, Xenophobia and Anti-Semitism Connections. Thank you, Barbara Lee, Angela Mullis, Jude McLean, and especially Sahara Aziz for her exemplary scholarship and her leadership in organizing this conference. First, I want to acknowledge we are on the original homelands of the Lubec peoples, taken by Dutch and British colonists, continued by a new nation of revolutionaries, touting a contradictory Republican form of democracy while continuing the colonialist policies of dispossession, enslavement, and extraction. So we have, as a nation, yet to address, really, the triplets of these triplets and violations and the injustices involved. And that continues to shake the foundations of the U.S. nation today, and in many ways speaks to our inability to respond to many injustices around the world, but also, I believe, to the basic international injustice of global warming as well. Second, I offer these land acknowledgements as an important thematic context in which we should acknowledge that the U.S., the formation of the U.S., North America, and the Americas themselves, and the Caribbean, as we know them today, emerge in what Walter Mignolo terms the dark side of modernity and the dark side of the Western Renaissance. And in fact, the very formation of our institutions of universities, historical societies, really the structure of knowing itself are impacted by that dark side. And we have yet to quite come to terms with that. So conferences like this are quite important for that very reason. So I'll say more later on, but I really wanted to introduce our speakers. And if it's okay, I'll introduce all of you at once, just to save some time, because we have 5 speakers, one who is coming to us from online. So that'll save a little bit of time. First, we have John Farmer, Jr. is director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics. He's a university professor and director of the Miller Center for Community Protection and Resilience at Rutgers College. He is the former Attorney General of New Jersey. He served as senior counsel for the 9/11 Commission and is author of The Ground Truth, The Untold Story of America Under Attack on 9/11. Dr. Farmer has served as Dean of Rutgers School of Law, New York, Senior Vice President and University Counsel, and he has served on the New Jersey State Ethics Commission and received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the New Jersey Law Journal in 2015. Fareed Hafez is a political scientist. He's a non-resident senior researcher at Georgetown University's The Bridge Initiative and resident scholar at Salzburg University. And he was a Fulbright visiting scholar at UC Berkeley in 2017. He received the Bruno Kreisky Award for the Political Book of the Year for his anthology Islamophobia in Österreich. Austria, right? I'm trying to pronounce a language I can't pronounce, which he co-edited with John Bunzel. He is editor of Islamophobia Studies Yearbook and co-editor of European Islamophobia Report. His current research focuses on Muslim youth movements in Europe, and his latest publication include Islamophobia in Muslim-majority societies. Murtaza Hussain is a national security journalist at The Intercept, which is a very important online journalist source for progressive news, whose work has featured also in the New York Times, The Guardian, CNN, and Al Jazeera English. Murtaza has reported around the world, including Egypt, Bosnia, Turkey, Jordan, and across Europe and the United States. His reporting has covered the intersection of national security, race, and surveillance, and has focused on disclosures of classified documents, including the Edward Snowden NSA archives in the United States and top secret Iranian Ministry of Intelligence files. Ivan Kalmar, who will be joining us from online, is a professor of anthropology and the Honorable Newton W. Rowell Professor of Victoria College at the University of Toronto. He is the author of Early Orientalism, Imagined Islam and the Notion of Sublime Power, and co-editor of Orientalism and the Jews. He recently guest edited a special issue of Patterns of Prejudice dealing with Islamophobia in the east of the European Union, and a special issue of Islamophobia in Germany, East-West, for the Journal of Contemporary European Studies. His current book project has the working title, Illiberal Democracy, East Central Europe's Revolt Against the Liberal West. And Marwan Mohammed is a sociologist at the Centre Maurice Halbach's in Paris and research fellow at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in CUNY. His main research interests are delinquency, gangs, organized crime, law and justice, as well as race and racism and Islamophobia in the French context. Dr. Mohammed's research methodologies are rooted in the experience of individuals, particularly in-depth observation and interviews. His most recent book is on the politicization of the word communitarism, communitarianism, yeah?
Communalism.
Okay.
Something like that.
Okay. And
yeah, there is no translation of this French word.
Okay, we'll have a fuller explanation soon. In France, with Julien Talpin in 2018, and he is currently researching criminal careers in the United States. So we're going to go in that order, and because we have such a large panel, if we could just stick to your time, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack, and good afternoon, everybody. The imaginary viewers who are out there. I really privileged to be here today, and I want to thank Sahar Aziz for inviting me to address this conference. I think it's really important to address the issue of global Islamophobia, because I think there's a lot at stake for the world's future and how we address this issue. I think where we are in the world right now is at a crossroads where the world has to decide what kind of world it's going to be. Frequently and all too often, nations define themselves as narrow ethnicities and defined by cultural experience. And the challenge that's posed for the world today, and the reason that I started doing the work that I'm doing a few years ago, is that that's not the world anymore. There's some estimates that 1 billion people in the world today are living in countries where they weren't born. So what you're looking at when you look at such a world is a world of vulnerable communities. My work started really as a sabbatical project. I had finished my stint as general counsel of Rutgers, and the deal when I took that thankless job was that at the conclusion of it, I would have a sabbatical year to do the kind of work that really interests me, which is public safety related. Going back to my days as Attorney General when we dealt with the issue in New Jersey of racial profiling and police practices. So I had a sabbatical year. I was going to spend it in Paris, teaching at the university, Paris 2, the law school. As my side project, I wanted to look at how do vulnerable communities protect themselves? What's the most effective ways that communities that are seen in various locations as the other are able to protect themselves? And I decided as an initial research focus to look at the Jewish communities in Europe because they are the original sort of diaspora community, and I figured, and they've existed in a hostile climate for centuries. So if anybody knows how to protect themselves in sort of a difficult environment, it would be those communities. So what started as an academic project took an unexpected turn when early on in my work, the Charlie Hebdo attack happened, and the attack on the kosher grocery. That day, I happened to be meeting for the first time with the Jewish community security people to sort of interview them, get a sense of what they thought the best practices would be. And so I got to sort of embed with them as the attacks unfolded. And and sort of lived it with them. Saw a lot of similarities, frankly, between in the looks on their faces and the reaction in Paris to what we saw after 9/11 here in the States. Just the fear of the unknown and what was going to happen next, the absence of good intelligence, and that really was, it really gripped the city. As it turned out, I had arranged the following week to go to Brussels and meet with the Jewish community security folks in Brussels to find out if their take on security issues was similar to Paris. They had had an attack on the Jewish Museum there the century before. And in the interim, I kept hearing the term Molenbeek, referring to a district in Brussels of about 94,000 people, largely Muslim district, where some of the attacks were emanating from. And when I was in Brussels, I really wanted to sort of understand that dynamic. And so I asked to meet with people from Molenbeek and was discouraged from doing so, but did get a meeting with the chief of police for that district, who was at the time, I believe still is, the highest ranking Muslim police officer in Belgium, Saad Amrani. And that was a real game-changing meeting for me, because Saad is he's a brilliant man. He speaks 7 languages fluently. He grew up in Molenbeek. We met in his office, which at the time, he was sort of a voice in the wilderness. No one was listening to him before all this happened. And his office was behind a basketball court and what looked like a YMCA. It was really sort of marginalized. But he talked for hours and sort of gave me a different perspective of that district than I was hearing on the media and the way the media was covering it. And so I really came to see Molenbeek as a vulnerable population in a way that really still isn't portrayed. Saad was from there, his family was from there, they'd been there for a long time, and he gave me the education that I needed to see the Molenbeek population as a vulnerable population. The fact that they had been there for generations and had never really been accepted as Belgians. The fact that there was a tremendous estrangement that existed, particularly among the young people, whose experience with the police, and we had, I'll get to this a little bit later, but we had interviewed several youths from Molenbeek who basically said, my interaction with the police is they throw me up against the wall every day and frisk me. And that's it. There's no other interaction I have with the Belgian police. So he painted a portrait that just simply wasn't being portrayed in the media. And when the attacks on the subway and the airport happened a few months later, we were actually asked by Saad and the Jewish community leaders as well to come back to Belgium, to Brussels in particular, and to see what we could do in terms of creating a relationship, not really reviving one, because there really never was one, but creating a relationship between that community and the police. So what we did, the method we used was we conducted interviews of everybody from the youths in the street, merchants, shop owners, beat police officers, 26 hours of interviews of 30 odd subjects. And we edited those videos into a training that we were able to deliver to the police in Belgium, and ultimately to a joint session of the community and the police. And it was eye-opening, because what was clear was when they started watching this is they had no idea how they were perceived by the community. They were shocked among on the faces of the police officers. A lot of arguing, a lot of anger. We had police ranging in attitudes from, I'm not a social worker, don't call me if you have a leaky pipe, that's not my job, to other police officers who said, well, you have to know what's going on in the community to police it. And if there's no relationship whatsoever, you tend to demonize the population you're policing. And that's sort of the dynamic that was occurring there, in my opinion. So we took those interviews, we edited them into these different segments, different topics, and it was revelatory. And the police had one session, just the police, because we wanted to expose them to it first. And they were, it was a very stormy session, but they were at the end. I think a lot of eyes were opened in terms of this is how our citizens are viewing us, and it's not positive. We then took the same body of archival videos and created a training to do with police and the Molenbeek community itself. And that had never happened. They had never been in the same room together. That's the degree of estrangement that we were confronted with. And again, it was no press. It was a very interesting and in some ways confrontational day. But what happened from that day, where relationships started to be formed. You can't address a problem of radical estrangement like we had, like we have in Belgium and elsewhere in Europe overnight. These things are going to take a really long time and a lot of diligent and hard work to build bridges between this community, which has been so estranged from mainstream Belgian community and the mainstream. And it's a painstaking process. And we also involved the Jewish community. And one of the interesting aspects of this, one of the best practices that we emerged from this work with is, certainly there are differences among those communities, but they have this common, especially in Europe, this commonality of security concerns, because they're both viewed sort of as the other. And the Jewish community had more of a relationship with the police, but even that wasn't terrific. There was estrangement there too. We actually were successful in introducing leaders of the Jewish community with the Muslim community leaders, and even though they had grown up less than 5 miles apart, they'd never met each other. And that's one of the ways in which progress can be made, I think, is when vulnerable communities identify each other as potential partners on certain issues, even if they disagree on others, progress can be made. So we an organization our size, which is relatively new, just a few years old, can't possibly solve this problem. But what we can do, and what we do is we go into areas like Brussels after the attacks, where the community knows it needs help, and it knows that there are these tremendous gaps in communication and in culture that need to be bridged. And I think our organization plays a role, of a small one, but I think an important one, in potentially bridging those divides. I think the populism that is sort of sweeping the world is a reaction to the condition I described at the outset. So many people now have migrated to other places. There are others everywhere. This past year, I was privileged to participate in a subcommittee effort of the Homeland Security Advisory Council, consisting mainly of religious leaders of different faiths, chaired by Brookings Institution's John Allen. And we visited religious communities across the United States, ranging from Sikh temples, mosques, Catholic churches, black churches in the South that have been firebombed, Mormon churches, which have also had an arson issue out west. And the commonalities, in my view anyway, outweighed the differences, in the sense that you see the same fear, you see the same feeling of estrangement from mainstream law enforcement, which reflects the majority of the people, and sometimes overlooks the others in their midst. And I think the issue in America is slightly different. I think it's more difficult in Europe because of the history, because of the tradition of identifying nations sort of narrowly in ethnic and cultural terms. America is a little bit more open than that. But as Jack said in his introduction, the issue is here too. I mean, the struggle between how you're going to define yourself as a people exists here as well. It exists all over the world. And if the world is going to make progress, I think it has to go in the direction of finding ways from the many to become one, e pluribus unum, which it's an ongoing debate in America. We fought a civil war over whether we would become an ethnic identity nation or an inclusive one, and the struggle continues. It doesn't go away just because one side lost the civil war. So I think that's where the world is, and I think looking at it through the lens of global Islamophobia is an important way to sort of see our way forward to perhaps a better future. Thank you.
Well, I want to start by thanking Rutgers for hosting this event and all of you who made it out and watching on the live stream. And thank you, Sahar, for organizing it. It's a very important event, and Sahar is so important to us for organizing it and also helping frame these issues for the general public. And we thank her for that. I come to this subject a bit differently from most of the panelists. I'm not an academic, I'm actually a journalist. So my experience with Islamophobia has been very practical in a sense. I've reported from a number of countries where I'd say that anti-Muslim attitudes have informed the local politics. It's been in the Balkans, in France, and also in the United States, where I would argue that anti-Muslim attitudes have, to a great degree, informed national security policy and law enforcement, especially over the last decade and a half. So earlier this year, in January, I was in Oslo reporting on a story that had nothing to do with Islamophobia per se, but it did bring me very close to the reality of what's going on in Europe and the United States at the moment. As I was working, I was receiving updates that there was a shooting in a mosque that had taken place not far from where I was staying. So as a journalist, you have to sort of overcome your evolutionary programming. And so I immediately called an Uber and tried to get as close to the mosque as possible. And I did get dropped off there, and I arrived in the vicinity of the mosque, and there was a huge police presence there. And by this time, it was pouring rain, and some people had exited the mosque. They were waiting outside, congregating, people who were inside the mosque when this attack had taken place. And I got talking to them, and essentially they described to me what happened. A young man had walked in with a gun, and he tried to break through the glass of the mosque to try to enter it, and he was successfully restrained by worshippers before he was able to inflict any casualties. Unlike other very high-profile events in the last year or so that people were successful in killing people in these attacks. They had described to me, essentially, they'd gotten out, and I would say that they, at this time, were very traumatized and very disoriented by what had just occurred. Now, it later emerged that this young man who had attempted to carry out this attack had, like many other young men, released a manifesto explaining his motives, and he described himself as a white supremacist who was interested in the cultural and racial purification of Europe, and the purification of Muslims from Europe violently was a very integral component of it. Now, I've come back to this event because I think that this shooting and many other similar events that have taken place in Europe over the last several years highlights to me a very key difference broadly between Islamophobia in Europe and Islamophobia in the United States. Now, Islamophobia in the United States is very centered upon national security. It's related to issues of terrorism, fear of Muslims, the idea that Muslims have a proclivity to violence. You see this in many egregious cases of entrapment, and elevated public security at airports and other places, scrutiny of Muslims, and law enforcement scrutiny of places where Muslims gather. And in her introductory remarks to the event, Sahar actually brought up an extremely important example of this in New Jersey, which was the Vortex 5 case, where a group of young men who were, I would very strongly argue, completely innocent of the allegations against them, who at their sentencing, the judge actually commented on the lack of evidence against them, but still sentenced them because he said that if there was not an issue for the jury, it should not be an issue for him. They were sentenced to life imprisonment in very harsh circumstances. And this is an example of how law enforcement in the past, and to some extent today, continues to employ the fear of Muslims as a tool for aggressive policing and then later sentencing and judicial punishments. Now, so that's very bad, and that's definitely how it's been played out in the United States, I've seen in the last several years. In Europe, the way that Islamophobia, in my experience, is framed is quite different. It's not framed primarily as a national security threat, even though maybe in aggregate numbers, the level of the threat in national security may be higher. It's framed as something totally different. It's a civilizational threat to European identity. And unlike in the United States, where fear of Muslims or anti-Muslim attitudes may wax and wane given political circumstances, this is a very constant sort of fear, and it's long-standing, and it may be influenced by terrorism, or you may give it a boost, but it would exist even without any of these groups, and has very deep roots, in fact. Now, I actually want to, by way of illustration, I actually want to talk about a book which is very interesting, and it highlights, I think, the core of this difference. It's a French book, which I'm sure people here have heard of. It's called Submission by Michel Lubec. Now, I read this book in English translation, and I found it very interesting because I'm not going to spoil the book, but I'll just describe to you broadly what it's about, and I think the title sort of suggests it as well, too. It's a book in which the main character is a depressed, sexually obsessed academic, and he's living in a French society which is described as morally relativistic, rudderless, and pointless. And essentially, this individual and French society, in the near future, is confronted with a circumstance in which a Muslim Brotherhood-linked party rises to political power in France. And in this essence, French society is depicted as being laid prone by the resurgence of a much more confident, young, and virile civilization, which in the book is described as Islam. And as a result of that, France becomes Muslim, not necessarily by coercion, but a sort of civilizational coup d'etat, which happens to be delivered by Muslims in this case. Now, I wouldn't say that the book is complementary to Muslims or Islam. It's a very caricatured portrayal of what Islam and Muslims are like. And if I was a French Muslim, I think I'd be quite offended by someone who's my neighbor and compatriot writing this book. Essentially, Muslims are depicted as very commonly having multiple preteen wives. If you convert to Islam as a French person, that instantly gives you access to lucrative personal connections with Gulf oligarchs. It's not a real reality of what Islam is like. It's a tabloid caricature. And yet it functions as a very effective device because he is touching a nerve that I think would be ridiculous if you touch it in the United States. If you were to write a book like this in the United States, no one really believes that American civilization is going to be replaced by any form of Islam, liberal or otherwise, at any time in the future. And if someone were to say that, they would actually raise the question of what exactly is being replaced by what. Whereas in Europe, this seems to have touched into a very key feeling that immigrants and Muslims lately in particular, but throughout history from other groups, by their existence, they pose a threat in the near term or the long term to the identity of the society. And in fact, their presence is somewhat threatening. So when there were terrorist attacks in Europe, and even before there have been laws like this, it's been very interesting to me to watch because not always does it manifest in security policy changes. It manifests in things which actually have nothing to do with anything, like restrictions on wearing hijab, laws, mandating handshakes, which I think in the age of coronavirus maybe have been premature, and essentially a cultural retaliation against Muslims broadly that has nothing to do with counterterrorism or nothing to do with security policy, but in effect targets them en masse on a communitarial basis. Now, one of the places that I've reported from quite a bit, and I find to be quite relevant for a number of reasons, is the Balkans. As you all know, in the early 1990s, there was a very horrific genocide that took place in Bosnia, in which over 100,000 people were killed, and the effects of that are still manifest throughout the Balkans today. Now, during that war, there was a perception of, it was a very Islamophobic war in a sense. It was a progenitor to a lot of the ethnic conflicts we see today. The Bosnian Muslims were outnumbered and outarmed, and they were subjected to a type of ethnic cleansing which was very much focused on their religious identity. Rape and other forms of sexual violence were used very methodically to try to destroy Bosnian Muslims' ability to reproduce themselves as a community. Like many Balkans people, Bosnians are socially conservative, a lot of them, in some ways, and this was viewed as an effective tactic to break the morale of the society by targeting women and very often educated and prominent women as a way of sending a message. Of course, religious leaders were heavily targeted, and they were killed often in very spectacular and public ways, again, to demoralize Bosnian Muslims. And Bosnian Muslims, if you're familiar with them, they're quite secular in many sense. They're very European and Slavic, but their identity is flattened to the fact that they're Muslims, and they're treated upon that basis. And I've been at the site of mass grave, where mass graves were exhumed, and it was described to me that, when we exhumed bodies, oftentimes we exhumed parts of mosques too, because what they would do is during these executions, they would destroy the local religious sites and they would bury people at the top of the minaret of that community, just to send a very communitarian message. Now, the Bosnian Genocide, any normal person I think would be horrified by it, but in reality, to certain sections of the far right, what happened in Bosnia is, in many senses, a model of what developments they'd like to see happening across Europe and even more broadly. Now, last year, as you're all aware, there was a shooting in New Zealand by a man named Brenton Tarrant, in which 50 Muslims were killed. And Mr. Tarrant, just before the shooting, released a manifesto describing his motivations and his influences. We can glean some very important things from this manifesto. Mr. Tarrant was obsessed with the Bosnian genocide, and Anders Breivik before him also exhibited similar tendencies. But Tarrant actually wrote the names of Serbian nationalist figures on the gun he used. He described those figures very positively, and essentially he was hearkening back to a very rich history of anti-Muslim sentiment, which had its origins really in Europe, even though he was an Australian acting in New Zealand. But he could tap into this very rich reservoir of ideas which promote violently racial and ethnic purity and use them as a motivating factor somewhere very far away, removed by space and time. And his beliefs reach practice in a very horrifying way. Now, the idea of a homogeneous Europe, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, is something that came about. It's a fiction, but it was a fiction which was only brought into creation through violence. And even during the Bosnian Genocide, it came to be known later on that while European countries were expressing concern or some sort of perfunctory condemnation, European leaders in private were making comments which were quite different. And I want to share with you a very specific comment that later came to light in the Clinton tapes. It was a conversation between French president at the time, François Mitterrand, and an unnamed British official. They were discussing the developments in Bosnia, which were, as I described earlier. And Mitterrand is actually talking about it. He says that Bosnians don't fit in. And the British official in this conversation agrees with him and describes the genocide then ongoing as a painful but realistic restoration of a Christian Europe. Now, these comments came to light later, but they showed that even among the European mainstream, subliminally or subterranean to that, there is a very pervasive and dangerous idea of racial and ethnic purity that could be enacted through violence. You could even go further back about this, and I want to be cognizant of time, but during the Reconquista of Spain, and of course during the Holocaust, these ideas were brought into very wide-scale effect. There's a very interesting chapter during the Reconquista or after the Reconquista, which I think is relevant to current debates in Europe about surveillance of Muslim practices. And these are practices like wearing hijab, the level of religiosity. After the Spanish Reconquista, there was a community of Muslims called the Moriscos. And these were people who were former Muslims who were converted to Christianity. And about a century after they were converted, they were all still expelled to North Africa because it was deemed that they were not, something about their presence was seen as polluting. And there was always this paranoia of have they really become Christians? Are they secretly doing Muslim things? And this led to very intense surveillance of their practices. People were tasked to make sure they're not secretly praying, not secretly wearing hijab or doing other things seen as Muslim. So when you see today these laws in Europe being put into effect, that seek to circumscribe Muslim practice, this is drawing on a very rich wellspring of practices and ideas and attitudes that have frequently resulted in genocide and ethnic cleansing in the past, not just targeting Muslims, but also very prominently Jews. And we see them having a very long shelf life, even after very traumatic episodes such as the Holocaust. This brings me back to that day in Oslo. I actually make it a point always to read the manifestos of these mass shooters when they come out. I find them very interesting. I also read all the Islamophobic books that come out of Europe and elsewhere because I think it's very important to know what's being said. And it's happening with increasing frequency that the words that are being said, it all starts with words, but people are reaching praxis with their words and they're going out to mosques and synagogues and carrying out mass shootings. But this is a very atomized society. So far, we're seeing people act as individuals. But I do think there's an analogy I like to talk about, and it's something which also pertains to what happened in the Balkans, is that violence, you should think of it like a propeller engine. Essentially, every act of violence is like a tug at the engine. And it takes a lot to get the engine going. But each of these tugs is an effort to try to start the cycle of violence. And we also see violence from Muslim extremists who act in a similarly accelerationist sort of attitude. The day that that book I mentioned, Submission, was released, it was the same day as the Charlie Hebdo attack. And it's very incumbent upon us not to be put into gear by these sort of attacks. And those of us who can count ourselves part of civil society, in the times that we have, which are mostly placid, we can do what we can to tamp down those attitudes and to build connections, because unfortunately there will be attacks from the far right, from Muslim extremists in the future. But it's important to contextualize and build the defenses and the antibodies to prevent those who would like to get the propeller going from being able to do so. That's why I'm very grateful for this panel and for Sahar organizing it, because I think that every time we get together and have these discussions, it builds those defenses and prevents that from coming into effect. So thank you.
Well, that speech was heavy on my heart. Coming from Europe and feeling what you have been talking about and knowing this from a first perspective experience, that makes something with you. But nevertheless, I'll try to stick to what Sahar has asked me to talk about here at this conference. And first of all, I wanted to thank you, Judy, and all the others who had been participating in making this possible. So my talk's going to be on the rise of the extreme right and the role Islamophobia plays herein. Now, I'd like to start with this picture. This is actually a photo taken in March 2018 when former Trump chief strategist Steve Bannon spoke to the audience in the Swiss city of Zurich at an event organized by a right-wing magazine. And at this event, Bannon said two very interesting things. First, he argued that what he referred to as, quote-unquote, the revolt began right there, meaning Switzerland, with the right-wing populist leader Christoph Blocher, who at that time in the early 1990s mobilized against the entry into the European Union. And the second remark he made was he called Blocher the quote-unquote Trump before Trump, suggesting that Trump only learned populism from his European pioneers. So I won't delve into the question if Mr. Blocher was the first populist or not, but I think it's always good to bear in mind that the current anti-Muslim populism as a method, and I'll come to this definition later, that we are witnessing throughout Europe and in North America in party politics today has indeed its roots in Europe. So it was not Blocher, as I would suggest, who was the very first successful right-wing politician. The rise of populism is very strongly connected to the re-emergence of the far-right political parties in general. many of Europe's post-World War II far-right political parties have historical roots that reach back to a Nazi past or at least a Nazi milieu. And examples thereof would be the Austrian Freedom Party, the Swedish Democrats, or the French Front National, which is today known as the National Rally. All of them have historical links to a Nazi or fascist past. And these parties were founded even, some of them were by people who were into the Nazi camp. And at the beginning, immediately after the end of the Second World War, it was quite difficult for them to organize as political parties. But it took them a few decades to be able to really stand on solid feet. Thereof, they also were latecomers to the political game that was dominated following the Second World War by the centrist left Social Democrats and the centrist right conservative political parties. From the 1960s to the 1970s, these parties were still very small, and also the old-fashioned Nazis that were and the leadership of these parties were not really attractive to the people at that time. Far-right politicians regularly trivialized National Socialism, were openly anti-Semitic and very racist in their discourses. Most interesting, these political parties who were also quite anti-American, anti-globalization, and anti-Semitic did not see Muslims as their enemies per se in their early days. Their assumption was rather that as long as Muslims would not mix with them and live very far away in other countries, they should be seen as collaborators against Zionism and US imperialism. Why? Because globalization, especially the US, were imagined as the melting pot of multiculturalism, which is the enemy number one to the idea of racial purity. And also because of the inherent anti-Semitism, Israel was seen as a Jewish project that violated the self-determination of the Palestinians. So the far-right concept of ethnopluralism, as they call it, was the preservation of imagined homogeneous nation-states without the mixing of different ethnicities. Hence, while Muslims within Europe were not seen as a threat, they were only seen as potential allies as long as they would go back home again. But as we all know, following the influx of cheap blue collar from Muslim countries in the 1960s ongoing, these immigrants did not return back home, but they stayed. So it is also when the anti-Muslim dimension grew stronger. In the 1980s and 1990s, the slow rise of far-right racist discourses that targeted the respective ethnic communities in their countries, like Arab and Western Africans in France, Indian, Pakistani in Britain, Turks in Germany, Yugoslavs in Austria, and so on and so forth. So although we can already see in these racist discourses targeting the ethnicity some anti-Muslim dimension, especially with Jean-Marie Le Pen, the French far-right leader in the 1980s, the paradigmatic shift to focus more explicitly on the religious other only happened in the early 1990s. Islam was already seen as the new enemy on a global level even before, and much more so after the fall of the Soviet Union. And this made it possible to target Islam as the enemy within. In the late 1990s, it was Pim Fortuyn, a Dutch politician, who authored a book called Against the Islamization of Our Culture in 1997. And he was the very first politician that introduced a very comprehensive Islamophobic program. Fortuyn, to me, seems to be an interesting new phenomenon within the field of populism. Why? Because he was, other than most traditional far-right parties, historically not linked to a Nazi past or a fascist past. Rather, he was a new, independent, much younger, more dynamic figure than, let's say, the old-fashioned French Jean-Marie Le Pen. And Fortuyn, most importantly, introduced a completely new way of culturally arguing a racist position. He was, first of all, openly gay, which made him a quite uncommon far-right politician at that time. And he argued that Islam was a threat to liberal democracy and a hindrance to the integration of immigrants. So while the traditional far right argued that Islam and the racial other to defend racial and cultural purity, this new populist style mobilized against Islam and Muslims as a threat to homosexuality, women's rights, and secularism. And this opened up a new horizon of argumentative arsenal for the far right. So from the mid-1990s to the early 2000s, the far right adopted what I would call Islamophobic populism as a synthesis of Islamophobia and populism, as you can see here on the screen. This table shows the parallels between the classical features of populism as a content and a method and Islamophobia as early defined already in the Runnymede Trust report, parts of it at least. So populism and Islamophobia are about simplification, dichotomization, and the dual worldview that divides the world into good and evil Islam and the good West. And this confrontation and antagonism is possible because the West is seen as the palladium of democracy, human rights, and civilization, whereas Islam is standing for dogmatism, fanaticism, misogyny, and so on. Populism and Islamophobia homogenize a monolithic nation, a folk, and place it in confrontation with the other, which is Islam. And populism and Islamophobia play a role in the production of anti-elitist as well as racist affects. So what I show you now is a poster or ad of the far-right Austrian Freedom Party from the early 1990s. And it was saying, Vienna shall not become Chicago. Chicago here is used as an embodiment of the far-right's scapegoat to all social illnesses, multiculturalism, and what they would call black crime. 10 years later, the same party uses the slogan, Vienna shall not become Istanbul, replacing the image of the other as the black and the social liberal to the Turkish Muslim other. Istanbul representing an old city of the Ottoman dynasty, which is Muslim. And this shift was paradigmatic not only for Austria's far right, but really throughout the Western Europe. And from a historical perspective, and I think Ivan will speak later about this, there was also 100 years before another slogan by the teacher in terms of anti-Semitism for Adolf Hitler, who said, Vienna shall not become Jerusalem. So these far-right pictures are just a snapshot from some of the election campaigns of far-right political parties in Europe, where Islamophobic populism has been used to mobilize against the Muslim other. You can see within the last 20 years, the anti-Muslim position has become central to European far-right parties, especially regarding the electoral campaigns and their party platforms. So for traditional far-right parties, the focus on Islam and Muslims as the new threat opened up a window of opportunity. By mobilizing against Muslims, traditional far-right parties tried to rid themselves of their historical stench of their fascist image and their anti-Semitism in order to become more acceptable to a broader electorate. And this indeed, I would argue, allowed them to appeal to voters who do not consider themselves openly racist or anti-Semitic, who are not attached to any Nazi past, and who are concerned with what they perceive as the threat of radical Islam that dominates the media coverage as well as the public perception of Islam, as we've already heard. So the contemporary European far right presents Islam as a threat to the spiritual foundations of the West, meaning values such as freedom, democracy, the rights of women, and so on and so forth. And the defense of liberal values becomes a key part of the far right strategy against Islam. However, it is not only the far right, but also some liberals who demand Muslim cultural assimilation or expulsion, and who advance policy proposals that would render Muslims invisible. But for the far right, by tapping into what I would call this more accepted form of racism of Islamophobia, a number of far right parties try to become more mainstream. An apparent obstacle on this path was the history of anti-Semitism. And that's why we can see an attempt by far-right parties to date to try to use its Islamophobic ideology for portraying itself as the new defender of the Jewish community. Far-right politicians use the strategy of what is called the victim reversal, which means that there is an attempt to draw a parallel between Islam and National Socialism. Supporters of this argument see anti-Semitism as something that is deeply rooted in Islam itself. And the function of portraying contemporary Muslims as the executors of Nazi reverent ideology is to construe the Muslim religion as genocidal and to portray Muslims as the principal enemies of Jews in the past and the present. Accordingly, Europeans become victims in solidarity with the Jews. And the far right is portraying itself standing side by side with Jews and, maybe more important, with Israel against the Islamic threat. So Muslims are branded the fascists. We all know this Islamofascism that came originally from here, from the States of our time. And this strategy, I would say, is best documented in the so-called Jerusalem Declaration from 2010, which was signed by several political parties from the far right, including the Austrian Freedom Party, the Belgian Vlaams Belang, the German Freedom Party, and the Swedish Democrats. On a European level, that really enabled, and I would argue that all of these tendencies have really created a large, enormous shift, which has brought a completely new landscape of the political parties, how they are positioned. On a European level, this enabled far-right political parties to come closer together and even have formal cooperation. Now, we have to know that in the past, European far-right parties, let's say from the Front National and the Austrian Freedom Party, they would never sit on a table together 20 years ago. Why? Because there was always this idea that those are Nazis, and if you sit with them, you're sitting with Nazis, right? Today, 20 years later, we have in the European Parliament the group Identity and Democracy, which is a successor to another group in the European Parliament called the Europe of Nations and Freedom Group. And they are not only formally cooperating, they are exchanging and they are sharing values. In the past, they would fight each other because within every European nation state, you have, let's say, a Bulgarian minority or a German minority or whatever kind of minority. But now you have a shared value of Islamophobia that really unites all of these parties together in one struggle. And this shift also facilitated international cooperation that was not there in the past. With the rise of the Tea Party within the Republican Party, it opened the possibility of transatlantic cooperation the first time. Islamophobia also became the shared value for far-right politicians from Israel, the United States, and Europe to foster exchange and cooperation. So just to give one example, I think most of us will still remember when Republican Congressman Peter King invited Geert Wilders to give a screening of his movie, right? Again, let's remember, 20 years ago, the famous or infamous far-right political leader Jörg Haider was not allowed to enter Israel, right? Because he was considered an anti-Semitic politician. Now we have delegations of far-right parties who are not welcomed maybe by Benjamin Netanyahu, but they are allowed into the country. They are trying to create their bonds with other far-right Israeli political parties. Now, what are the repercussions of the general electoral success of the far right and their focus on Islamophobic populism? And I will end here with three remarks. First of all, far right parties have been mediocre in their electoral success still. So in opposition, I would argue they still might be even more influential than in power. In most Western European countries, they have been dominating the public discourse with their identitarian and racist agenda. Anti-Muslim and other racist legislation have been implemented not by far-right parties, but by centrist parties from the right and even from the left, out of fear to lose votes to the far-right parties. And I think Bernard Stasi's hijab ban in 2003 in France is maybe one of the earliest examples for this move. And I suppose, I don't know if Marwan Mohammad's going to talk about it briefly, because I think it's a very central issue if you look to Islamophobia in France. And today, many centrist right parties have even completely co-opted the anti-Muslim agenda of the far right that they had presented 15 years ago. Second, with this hegemony also came a radicalization of the anti-Muslim agenda in the public discourse. Things that would not have been utterable 15 years ago are very commonplace today. And third, last but not least, I think after more than 2 decades in opposition in most Western European countries, we can also see that far-right political parties coming to power and being mainstreamed has become the new normal. And they also have been very influential in shaping European politics. That's the case in Austria, in Denmark, in Italy, where we all had interior ministers who were from far-right parties. And that's also what we can see, I think, the way how we should look at the border politics of Europe today vis-a-vis the Syrian refugees is an outcome of this racist discourse that emanated originally from the far right. So thank you for your attention, and looking forward to discussion afterwards.
Okay. So I'd like, first of all, to thank Sahar Aziz, Barbara Lee, Angela Mullis, Jude McLean, and all the other people involved in organizing this important event for inviting me. And I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. I've been asked to speak on Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in Europe, a topic already so ably discussed by the earlier speakers, and you'll see that my talk follows quite organically upon Farid's. I've written extensively, as have others, on the deep history in the Western Christian imagination of seeing Judaism and Islam and Jews and Muslims as closely connected, 2 sides of the same coin. Today, I'd like to focus more on the recent moment than on history, and we'll be discussing one specific country, Hungary. I do think the situation in Hungary today provides an example that is widely applicable, even to the United States. But the similarities between Hungary, the rest of Europe, and the rest of the world, I'll leave implicit today in order to keep within my allotted time. Though these are similarities that I'd certainly encourage the people in the audience to think about. The title of my presentation is Islamophobia and Anti-Semitism, the case of Hungary and the so-called Soros plot. Hungary is run today by Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and his meekly obedient Fidesz party. Orbán has a majority in the Hungarian parliament, which he's utilized to push through legislation that benefits his business cronies and muzzles the opposition. To marshal his majority, Orbán utilized the migration crisis of 2015 and 2016 to stoke up Islamophobic fears in the country. He called the migrants Muslim invaders. He opined that the, quote, migrant crisis reaching Europe has in fact broadened into a civilizational crisis. The East has come to the West, unquote. Orbán was once a moderate, right-of-center liberal. What I see in Hungary as elsewhere is not that the fringe, frankly Islamophobic and or anti-Semitic parties necessarily become elected, but rather that their fringe ideas are picked up and legitimized by the mainstream. But for this process to have succeeded, the ideas stolen by the mainstream from the far right have first to be sanitized. My thesis is that when the mainstream adopts the hatreds of the far right, it adopts the Islamophobia, but not the anti-Semitism, at least not at the explicit level. In fact, it loudly declares its anti-Semitism, along with its love of Israel. But, as I said, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are historically and logically intertwined. In the Western Christian world, if you scratch the surface of Islamophobia, you find anti-Semitism. And if you scratch the surface of anti-Semitism, you find Islamophobia. In Peter Sellers' famous film, the ex-Nazi Dr. Strangelove is unable to completely discipline his right hand, which he has to keep pressing down so it doesn't embarrass him by rising into a Nazi salute. Similarly, the Orbans, like the Trumps of this world, need to continuously apologize for their own anti-Semitic slips and to fire subordinates who suffer from the same disease. Actually, the brilliance of their anti-Semitism is not that it hides their covert anti-Semitism. On the contrary, it's that the voters on the far-right fringe see through it. They recognize the anti-Semitism of the mainstream as contrived and ascribe it to pressure from, quote unquote, the Jews. At the same time, moderate right-wing voters, including Jews, can conveniently close their eyes to the crypto anti-Semitism, happy to support anyone who will help them in the fight against their real enemy, the liberal and progressive left. Having reflected on this process, I formulated a list of 4 things that happen when a mainstream political formation seizes the opportunity to gain votes by espousing Islamophobic rhetoric. 1, the mainstream formation adopts Islamophobic, ethno-nationalist, and illiberal rhetoric from the fringe. 2, the mainstream sanitizes its own Islamophobic rhetoric by rejecting anti-Semitism. 3, the leadership of the fringe formation does the same. They too reject anti-Semitism. And 4, the diehard anti-Semites of the original fringe leave the fringe party and found their own movement. In sum, the mainstream right rises at the expense of the far-right fringe, which splits up in response. The more moderate far-right now also sheds its anti-Semitism, leaving the most extreme far-right to be the only openly anti-Semitic segment of politically active society. Why does Islamophobia work as an electoral strategy, but not anti-Semitism? Islamophobia provides usable tropes of hate that a politician can unfortunately use to manipulate the electorate. Many of these tropes have a pedigree going back to centuries and have been formed in conjunction with anti-Semitism. But in Europe after the Holocaust, overt anti-Semitism as opposed to covert anti-Jewish attitudes is still essentially unacceptable in polite society. It's also true that the financial backers of international Islamophobia include a small circle of right-wing American Jewish donors who exercise a major influence in Israel. You may need such people if you want to market right-wing ideas, but you cannot expect to gain their friendship through overt anti-Semitism. They can be fairly tolerant of covert anti-Semitism, though, as long as it's directed against the left. Viktor Orban has shown himself to be the master of mainstreaming Islamophobia, along with a see-through anti-Semitism that barely covers its murky anti-Jewish foundations. The prime exhibit is Orban's campaign against George Soros. This Hungarian-born American Jewish investor has poured millions into human rights, educational, liberal, democratic, and progressive causes. Soon after the fall of the communist regime in Hungary, Soros's Open Society Foundation, or OSF, became an important force in the building up of Hungarian democracy and civil society, including opportunities for Roma and other disadvantaged groups. In 2017, Soros gave OSF $18 billion, making it the world's third largest charitable foundation and the largest with a left-wing tinge. In form, the Soros plan, or the Soros Myth, as I shall call it, is a direct descendant of the notorious Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the widely read and believed Russian forgery of 1903. The Protocols accused a group of Jewish elders of plotting to dominate the world through secretly supporting political and economic movements, both capitalism and communism. This image of financial manipulators supporting the anti-capitalist left is reproduced in the Soros myth, but there are more specific connections as well. The head of the conspirators in the Protocols is the Jewish banker Rothschild, and much of the anti-Soros rhetoric, especially the less censored variety found on social media, associates Soros with the current Rothschild banking house. Moreover, both the Protocols and much anti-Soros rhetoric today associate the Freemasons with the plot and or their associates, the Illuminati. On the 2018 parliamentary election campaign trail, Orban pictured Soros as the nation's enemy number one. He spoke of an enemy that is, quote, unlike what we are. It is not national, but international. It does not believe in work, but speculates with money. It is not generous, but vengeful, and always aims at the heart, especially when the heart is red, white, and green, which are the colors of a Hungarian flag. Europe and Hungary are in the very midst of a civilizational struggle, unquote. Orban's speech was widely understood as drawing on anti-Semitic tropes, and yet Orban never strayed into explicit anti-Semitism. The strongest "I am not an anti-Semite" argument was provided to Orban by Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, who knows for how long, of Israel. Soros's human rights foundations in Israel have been severely critical of the country's conduct vis-à-vis the Palestinians. This gained the Soros myth the support of not only the Israeli prime minister, but also his important American donors and allies among Jewish Republicans and Christian evangelicals. It appears to have been Netanyahu himself who suggested to his Hungarian friend the services of the American Jewish political consultants Arthur Finkelstein and George Birnbaum. In turn, Finkelstein and Birnbaum may have convinced the reluctant Orban to adopt the Soros myth, which had been around for 2 decades already in authoritarian countries ranging from Malaysia to Russia. The strategy helped Orban's Fidesz party to score a huge win in the 2018 parliamentary elections. As for Jobbik, in a desperate attempt to provide a meaningful opposition to Orban, it had made some noises opposing Orban's anti-Soros rhetoric. Jobbik, the originally far-right opposition party. In October 2017, the party sued Soros with the declared intent of discovering in court if the government's charges against Soros were true. If not, said the Jobbik spokesperson, then it will be revealed that they're nothing but, quote, a giant act of brainwashing, a giant lie, unquote. The court rejected the case. Fidesz responded by accusing Jobbik of being, as one article put it, quote, Muslim-friendly Soros lovers, unquote. It is true that the old Jobbik's attitude to Islam and Muslims had been relatively positive, and this can be connected to what Farid said about the erstwhile Islamophilia of the far right. The party's charismatic leader, Gabor Vona, even went as far in 2010 as to proclaim that, quote, today, mankind's last remaining bastion of traditional culture, experiencing the transcendent in everyday life, is the Islamic world, unquote. However, an even more powerful source of Jobbik-style Islamophobia was the party's passionate Islamophilia, was the party's passionate and explicit anti-Semitism and racially tinged anti-Zionism. In 2010, the Jobbik leader suggested that all the other parties were part of a Jewish conspiracy which supported alleged Israeli designs to, quote, buy up Hungary, unquote. So radically anti-Semitic was the early Jobbik that when it was discovered that Csongrád Szegedy, one of its top leaders, had Jewish ancestry, he was expected to and did resign, and he emigrated to Israel. Jobbik's questionably motivated Islamophilia put it in the wrong spot at the time of the migrant crisis. It meant that the party did not immediately understand the potential for political exploitation of the situation via Islamophobia. In October 2017, the poll suggested that the migrant issue was owned more by Fidesz than by Jobbik. More of the mainstream party's voters showed negative attitudes to migrants and Soros than those belonging to its far-right competition. The dominant group within the party's leadership, headed by Vona, realized that things had to change. To defeat Fidesz, Jobbik needed allies from the opposite end of the political spectrum, from the left and center-left. But there, none of the leaders, which included the former Prime Minister Gyurcsány, who had a Jewish wife, could be expected to link up with the self-professed anti-Semites. Vona therefore reinvented himself as a moderate Democrat. Quote, the kind of anti-Semitic expressions which took place in Jobbik earlier, unquote, he said, would now, quote, naturally draw the most severe sanctions, unquote. In 2016, Vona for the first time sent Hanukkah greetings to the Jewish community, an exercise he repeated the next year. As the party ostensibly abandoned its anti-Semitism, it fought accusations that it was pro-Muslim and pro-migrant. Although it labeled Fidesz's policy simplistic, it agreed with the government's refusal of EU-imposed quotas for settling refugees and its building of the anti-migrant fence in 2016. During the campaign for the April 2018 elections, Jobbik's posters featured a large portrait of Vona with the slogan, quote, we'll shut out the migrants, we'll raise the wages, we'll lock up the thieves, unquote. Vona's move did not fail to excite opposition among many of Jobbik's diehard supporters. The party's erstwhile paramilitary wing, the Hungarian Guard, had been banned for its racist activities in 2010. The Gardists openly praised the Crossed Arrow Party, the puppet rulers of Hungary after the German invasion of 1944, who were instrumental in the deportation of most of Hungary's Jews outside of Budapest to death camps. In 2008, a series of racially motivated killings of Roma in Hungary were associated with former Guard members who had found even the Guard ineffectual. Now, after the ban on the Guard, Vona, who had been the Guard's president, distanced himself from the former Gardists. He similarly disassociated himself from other unrepentantly anti-Semitic and anti-Roma replacements of the Hungarian Guard, such as the Hungarian National Guard and the Civil Association for a Better Future. According to a letter signed jointly by Amnesty International, the NGO Human Rights First, and the European Roma Rights Center, as late as March 2011, Vona personally incited the Civil Guard Association as it bullied Roma during a rally in the town of Gyöngyöspata. 6 years later, however, with his political facelift in full swing, Vona suggested that he wished to focus not on the unfortunate past, but on the future, and that he is, quote, never seen Jobbik as anti-Roma, anti-Semitic, or racist. In reaction, some far-right groups chose to support Fidesz rather than Jobbik in the 2018 elections. The leader of the obstinately anti-Semitic and anti-Roma motorcycle association, Goy Bikers, Goy Motorosok, signed a proclamation that included a long list of Fidesz's achievements and concluded with the endorsement to, quote, in the absence of a better alternative, on April 8, vote for the candidates of Fidesz KDNP so that Hungary can go on developing. The triumph of Orban's efforts to steal Jobbik's racist thunder without appearing to endorse its open anti-Semitic or radically anti-Roma rhetoric could not have been greater. On the other hand, by shedding, at least superficially, its anti-Semitic image and espousing Islamophobia more explicitly, Jobbik hoped to qualify as an acceptable mainstream party and someday an alternative to Orban's Fidesz. Thus, Hungary reached step 4 of the scheme that I outlined in the beginning. In June 2018, the hardline leader Laszlo Toroszkai split up from Jobbik and founded his own party, Our Homeland. With the Fidesz majority all but unassailable due to its sanitized anti-Semitic takeover of much of Jobbik's right-wing rhetoric, Vona retired, at least for the moment, for politics. Meantime, his followers hoped that their own anti-Semitism might give them a chance to gain enough respectability to lead an opportunist right-left alliance of all the opposition, which alone had a sliver of a chance to unseat Orban and Fidesz. How to fight Islamophobia and other hatreds in Hungary? Many citizens and NGOs are doing that on a daily basis. Someday in the long run, let's hope, their efforts will bear fruit. In the short term, maybe the strategy of uniting the opposition against Fidesz will work. In the unlikely event that it does so, don't hold your breath. In mainstream Hungarian politics, joining ambiguous anti-Semitism to unadulterated Islamophobia has sadly worked only too well. It's hard to see who will kill this goose that lays golden eggs. Thank you.
I would like to thank you for your invitation and the organization of this symposium. I'm glad to be here, and I'm proud to be a part of this panel. I'm grateful to the whole team for making it possible. My 15 minutes presentation aims to explain why Islamophobia is so specific, so intense, and so deep in French society, its institutions, and the law. And this is not by coincidence if most of the panelists talk about French as an example. This is not by coincidence. As we worked with my colleague Abdelali Hajat, France can be considered the laboratory of institutional and cultural Islamophobia in the West. We reached this conclusion when we published our book on Islamophobia in French, on why and how the Muslim problem was constructed by the French elites. This Muslim problem has been constructed in many places, such as public schools, public services, the workplace, leisure areas, or TV shows, commercial areas, the street, and so on. And with this slide, you can this slide shows some snaps of media covers on Islam and Muslim presence in France. And these newspaper and magazines are from the left side to the far right. For example, Valeurs Actuelles is a far right journal, and Marianne was a left magazine, or the Nouvel Observateur was a left magazine. It's really important to account for historical context and the multiple roots of Islamophobia to avoid letting oneself get sucked into a conjectural and short-term vision of the specifics of French Islamophobia. And I agree with Mustafa Bayouni, who said this morning that before being global, Islamophobia is local and takes its roots locally and nationally. And in French, Islamophobia cuts right across political lines with a specific in intensity and consequences because Islamophobia rests on a plethora of foundations deeply rooted in national history and culture. But first of all, I would like to begin and introduce my remarks with a recent political sequence. With a professor of political science at the University of Versailles-Saint-Quentin-en-Yvelines, Laurent Bouvet, who is the member of the National Council on Laïcité, Secularism. The laïcité refers to the French version of the separation between church and state. Laurent Bouvet is appointed by the Minister of Education, minister who said in October 2018, the headscarf itself is simply not desirable in our society. Laurent Bouvet is also the founder and the leader of the Printemps Républicain, the Republican Spring, an organization identifying itself as part of the French left. Last September 2019, Laurent Bouvet had mocked up a modified version of a poster produced by the Federation of Parents Council, FCPE, and posted it online. The original image on the left of the slide, the original image showed a Muslim woman wearing a hijab, smiling with her daughter, and the slogan, quote, "Yes, I'm going on a school trip, so what? Laïcité is about including all parents in the school with no exceptions," end quote. Laurent Bouvet felt this statement was an affront to the principle of secularism or laïcité. Along with activists from his movement and others from the far right, he published a photomontage based on the original image from the poster in which the woman wearing a hijab and her daughter were replaced with two bearded ISIS fighters wearing combat fatigues and holding Kalashnikovs. Muslim women wearing hijab were thus a visual synonym for terrorist threats and symbolic of enemies to be fought. On 24 September 2019, the FCPE lodged a case of incitement to hatred against Laurent Bouvet, a figure embodying the middle-class neo-republican left in France, whose ideas resonate far more widely. Indeed, far from being confined to the left, his opinions are often communicated by the far-right press, in which he pens articles and answers readers' questions. He has also been supported by few leftist public figures. His current main targets are non-white supremacists, with whom he objectively shares some political campaigns, but non-white and left activists, scholars, artists who struggle against structural racism and inequalities in the French context. This hijab affair, one of so many that is no longer worth keeping count, reignited a recurring debate in France on laïcité, its moral economy, and legal parameters. This sequence, one among a lot, shows the mainstream, cross-party, and obsessional dimensions of the rejection of any Muslim religious visibility in the public sphere. And I'm not talking about security or terrorism or Muslim brotherhood. I'm talking about the daily life, the regular life, like just going to a school trip with your daughter. And even that is constructed as a threat for institutions, for kids, for the Republic. And this cross-party and obsessional dimension of rejection of Muslim, it constitutes one of the markers of the specifics of Islamophobia in the French context compared to other Western countries. How this kind of poster can be the object of such profound rejection by political figures located on a spectrum running from the far left to the white supremacist far right. The influence and impacts of imperialism, global domination, wars, and terrorism are important and really amplifies and frame the fears and the hate. But we have to account for the long-term mechanism that make it this political bipartisan hostility toward Islam and Muslims possible. The idea of mechanism here refers to the driving forces, the main ideological frameworks and social dynamics that make adherence to all or some of the forms of Islamophobic expression. I don't have the time to distinguish all of this long term, but I'm gonna focus on a few of them. First, the Christian anti-Mohammedism. You know, in the past, when you read the former Christian scholars during the Middle Age, etc., they were talking about Mohammedism or the Mohammed people, not Muslim or something like that. This is a different vocabulary, but the anti-Mohammedism has a long history. It's a specific anti-Muslim archive that was steadily accumulated over a long historical period of exposure in which Islam, a competing religion, and Muslim were configured as the dangerous and or inferior other in both theological thinking and Western politics. The Christian monopoly of anti-Mohammedism wore away in the face of competition from Orientalism, that is, the construction of a negative Muslim otherness drawn from the arts, literature, and increasingly science. This ideological labor of essentializing identity mirrors the theories establishing the existence of races within the mankind, where those races reflect hierarchical, biological, and psychological substrata of populations. The articulation of religion with race in these streams of thought helps racialize religious affiliation. This is one viewpoint that French colonial domination used as a basis for developing a racial definition of citizenship, excluding Muslim. And this non-assimilable nature of Muslim populations and the incompatibility of cultures and civilizations are ideas that permeate traditional white supremacist discourses and a rejection of the author. Contemporary Islamophobia extends, completes, and interlocks with traditional racism that targets other minorities deemed undesirable to have within national borders. French Islamophobia is also fed by a branch of the anti-clerical family identifies with the left and the far left via a virulent materialist anti-clericalism, drawing its potency from a superficial understanding of the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Rosa Luxemburg, addressing the relationship between religion and the people. These ideas, which feed into a number of social and political theories, conceptualize religious beliefs as obstacles to acquiring consciousness of the true social relations and form of domination nesting in them. And it's also important to talk about the role of mainstream feminism. The dominant stance within the French feminist movement was to consider the hijab as a religious political demand, both reactionary and threatening for the status of women. Not taking subjectivity or women's choice into account, this position framed the headscarf as a clothing statement to be countered per se, as it was presumed to be both anti-secular, anti-republican, and was as the result of women being manipulated from behind the scenes by a retrograde masculinity. But the question of secularism, laicity, became the main battleground. Laicity is a or is a household term in France. Intense struggles surround its definition and the ways in which it's applied through the law. The law on the separation of church and state passed on December 9, 1905, established the principle of laicity for the long haul. The principles of separation, freedom, equality, and non-discrimination structured this act after decades of antagonism and tension between the supporters of the Catholic Church and those backing the principle of the secularization of public authority. This overall balance was challenged by the passage of the Act of the March 15, 2004, which marked a major legal and political turning point. When laicity has been redefined as neo-laicity, new laicity, the principle of religious neutrality no longer sets its sights solely on public servants, but now also on service users and private sector workers. Even since 2004, neo-laicity has been a mechanism for controlling the bodies and minds of those perceived to be Muslims through a capillary movement. Since this act, the places and the reasons invoked to contest the visibility and certain social practices of Muslims have multiplied. This new secularism, new laicity, has therefore continued to spread in the private sector. For example, several court decisions have enshrined in law the possibility of prohibiting the wearing of a sign or the manifestation of a religion's identity, mainly the hijab or sometimes the beard. Of course, like all new laws, like all of laws limiting or making possible new limitations on individual freedoms, an apparent balance is maintained and enhanced between rights and duties. But the overall movement, whether in national or European case law, is marked by this movement to restrict freedoms by targeting Muslims. All of these recent laws and regulations are deeply transforming the philosophy of secularism, disrupting the liberal approach and redefining the idea and the border of the neutrality and the state neutrality. As the jurist Elsa Bourdieu also summarized in the Journal of Human Rights, quote, a shift has thus taken place from protection for all in 1905 to an obligation, whereas the time where this time neutrality applies to users of public service, in particular at school, to an injunction where the principle of neutrality of public authority is lost, as they now intrude into the private sphere of religious practices, end quote. Islamophobia, French Islamophobia, has to be seen as a vehicle, not only a racism against Muslim, but it has to be seen as a general vehicle, a political vehicle, which raise the racism in general, and the rise of Islamophobia is not a threat against Muslim, is also again a threat against all the minorities. That's a very important point. And the previous speaker said anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are completely connected. I agree with that. And some of the political, the some Jewish organization in France or public figure in France who are feeding the Islamophobia discourses. It's like a political, in long term, it's a political suicide, completely a political suicide. And as we can see here in US, some of the white supremacists who targeted Jewish in US, in synagogues, they refer to the Great Replacement Theory. And this Great Replacement Theory is framed now against Muslims, but it's used against other minorities in El Paso and in other Pittsburgh and in New Zealand, etc. For conclude, the second point is that Islamophobia today is the vehicle of the weakening of protection of minorities by the law. And this is the second point, not only in French, in the French law, but in the European law. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. I mean, it's such an incredible group of presentations, and I wish we had at least an hour to actually talk about the relationships. I mean, there's very important interventions and very important interconnected comments. We have about 10, 15 minutes left in the day, so I won't even pretend to ask each of you a question, but I would perhaps try to help synthesize a little bit of the day, and would love to have you comment as well and add your thoughts so that it's a chance, since we are at the end of the day, to kind of interlink and interconnect some of the comments that have been made. First of all, I was happy to say yes to Sahar just because I met her, and she's a new colleague, and I'm really delighted that we're on the same campus and we get to work together for hopefully many, many years to come. But I was just really saying yes, and I didn't understand the amazing people that she was gathering for this day. So I've been watching it from the early morning when I had other meetings. I was driving here, I was listening to the ambassador, and then being a part of this has been really a very unusual opportunity to hear really interesting thinkers who have been working alongside and building upon each other. And it's so rare to have these people together. And I think my biggest regret is that we don't have another full day to actually then talk about what has been presented. But I think there's clearly a book or a sequel conference here, and I hope that would be something that can begin to emerge. I wanted to just make a comment really about the necessity to continue decolonizing not only our kind of content and analytics, which are necessarily fairly specific to the locations that we work from and that we study, but also the interlinking questions of decolonizing the frameworks, assumptions, methodologies that really are at the heart of the institutions, so that we need to be constantly changing our institutions as well, and universities in particular. And one of the problems that we're facing is the particularization of our specializations and the difficulty of just simply coming together and talking together. It's not something that usually happens, but it is in some ways a major pressing challenge of what we need to do. Of course, even just within Rutgers itself, but of course across the Atlantic as well in this case. So that there's a chance of developing what Walter Mignolo also talks about, which is interculturalism and the possibility of translocal solidarities and collaborative thinking together and research to make that possible. So having said that, I thought it would be useful perhaps, hopefully, to reflect back upon Ambassador Rasool's intervention earlier, in which he was brilliantly kind of helping us understand the kind of strategy and action as the anti-apartheid movement was developing, and your reflections back upon that moment, and really a set of suggestions about what we need to do at this present moment. I think what we've also heard from the ensemble of other scholars is really the beginning efforts of really kind of a historical analytical toolkit that varies from place to place, but are key elements of something that can really be put together, I think, in an equally powerful way of reflection and synthesis that could perhaps work alongside this powerful strategic set of reflections and interventions. And of course, how we're going to be contesting these kinds of questions in our local areas, but also in our networks, are critical. And perhaps that'll be something that we can reflect upon in a positive way, in a similar positive way as the reflections upon that Ambassador Rasool has made. I guess I would say that the challenge that, given that, is that it's a challenge of how do we put together this scholarship that is not only very diverse here in this room and during this day, of now a growing body of scholars who are coming from area studies, Islamic area studies, so-called, but also practicing journalists who have been working on following Muslim communities. And there's now a group of scholars that we hadn't had just a short while ago. So that's very powerful. But also, how do we interlink this kind of scholarship that is emerging and this kind of rethinking and translocal kind of comparisons with the deeper forms of scholarship that have also been part of the engagements within the West and outside the West for decades. And in part, I'm thinking of Mustafa here, who has studied with Edward Said, and Edward Said's kind of ongoing legacy in some ways that helps us think through some of the questions that we're also engaging with. One of them, for example, is this ongoing way of thinking about Orientalism as a deeper historical phenomenon that, of course, begins in the European colonial cultures and who begin to represent the East as they think of it at that time, right? But of course, the East is a flexible plastic concept that goes further and further east. And the concept of yellowness, for example, which was part of Orientalism, begins in the Middle East. So we now talk about brown peoples, right? But in fact, that concept of yellow difference, in contrast to white, keeps on migrating eastward to South Asia, for example, to Central Asia, and of course to the Far East. And it's the Far East that we have, in some ways, the US form of Orientalism. In some ways, that helps to explain the difference and distinction between, let's say, Orientalism as it appears as a civilizational clash in Europe versus the America, where it's already become a form of trade and most favored nations, kind of secularism. But yet, at the same time, that kind of Far Eastern form of Orientalism, which both appears as phobia in terms of yellow peril, and China and Korea, North Korea certainly, is being played out, but also Japan as an enemy. Two forms of philia are similar patterns. So what is this historical connection between Europe and the Near East and the Muslim diaspora and the American penchant for Orientophobia in a Far Eastern yellow peril kind of formation, right? Now, part of what's been played out here is this, well, so one group seems to be favored and another group seems to be disfavored, and what does that mean in terms of Islamophobia? But I would just suggest that there's a larger historical terrain that we need to look at. And in fact, the work of Claire Jean Kim, for example, who's a political scientist at UC Irvine, where she talks about the formation of racial triangulation in the US. And if we were to update that to intersectional triangulation, that is both gendered and sexualized and racialized, then in some ways we have a tool that we can add to this that looks at the dynamic relationship between when Islamophobia and yellow peril, for example, interrelate, right? So I would just encourage us to, at another time, to be able to engage with these questions that are really just around our edge right now and very powerful and very important. And I would just say also that the study of populism of different kinds of state formations is going to be very important to name. So of course, we've talked a lot about the voting republics, even though many of these voting republics have actually quite strong totalitarian histories at different points in time. Other times they go through cycles of being more open, so that it's not such a dichotomous distinction between one or two parties or three parties. I mean, we have to look at the phenomena of how populism operates differently, but in some ways in very similar dynamics, as has been already talked about. And I guess I would just finally make a comment, which is that if the UN's IPCC report is correct, that we have roughly 10 years or less, to really deal and grapple with the global impacts of global warming. Then what does that mean in terms of what we're talking about? Now, certainly we already know that part of what it means is that there are more climate refugees. And many of those climate refugees are from Islamic nations moving through towards the first world first world countries, and which are perceived as having really the possibility of escape, right? But we're seeing that as a global phenomenon in which all this kind of othering is going to be cascading together. And how does this kind of near future phenomenon, in which in some ways what we're experiencing today during this quarantine and the social separation that is happening, going to be aggravated in some ways. This is the new normal. I think the reality that we're living today in some ways is an eerie science fiction of 2 years from now, in which all of us are going to be constantly forced into these kinds of weird situations, right? So I just want to offer those kinds of framings that are an effort to try to come up with a deep analytical toolkit that hopefully will be useful so that we can begin to talk across discourses and begin to compare where we're really at together. So I'd really welcome any comments. Hopefully that wasn't too crazy, but hopefully there might be individual comments that people would want to make. Yes?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment actually. Should I talk here?
It's actually picked up by the microphones on the table.
Good.
Yeah.
So, regarding what you said, I think a key distinction is the United States is a settler society, whereas European societies, they have a very developed tradition of blood and soil nationalism you could talk about. So the U.S. being a settler society results in radical discrimination in the past against African Americans, against Native Americans. And of course, there's discrimination against immigrants too, but their terrain is a bit different for that reason. Yeah. And that's why, with regards to Islamophobia, in Europe, measures like hijab bans and so forth have gotten a lot more traction. In the past, discrimination against observable Jewish practice, because people are operating in a framework that's not a settler society. There's not an amalgam of cultures. There's theoretically a default culture, and that's a construction politically and often through violence. But the fact that we live here, it can be an advantage in some regards. And that's not to say that European societies cannot adapt themselves and change, but the challenges here may be different to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, this raises the whole question of settler colonialism understood more globally as well. But I accept your point. I think it's a really important distinction, and that's part of the language exchange and the analytical exchange that we need to be engaging with. Yeah, so any other comments and observations about the whole day and kind of thinking about what these toolkits need to be? Yeah.
I think you brought up so many very important aspects that we should have more time to talk about. But we also spoke in the break very briefly. So let me just make a few remarks. Because also, my presentation was historically very restricted, right? From 1945 basically to today, and also in terms of the geography. But I think looking at the whole conversation about Islamophobia, I think there is very different approaches, and I see the literature having three different approaches to the understanding of Islamophobia. One is the prejudice studies, the other is the racism theory-informed approach, and the other is the third one, which I think you spoke about, is the decolonial one, right? And obviously, the way we approach the issue, the different, it very much depends on the outcome, and the questions we raise. They vary a lot depending on which approach we take. And I also fully agree with you that I think this whole decolonial approach is a very important aspect. First of all, because as much as the racism theory-informed approach, it is one that looks at the intersectionality of different aspects of gender, race, class, religion, and so on and so forth. And I think that's also in a way a chance, and I speak narrowly to the Muslim community. Why? Because the chance that lies in this is that there is an understanding can emerge that this is not a battle of religion, but this is basically a historical battle of the Western center and the rest of humankind. And this white Western center also not necessarily including the white working class, which is geographically located in the center of Western power structures, but rather excluding them as much as they are excluding all of the rest of the non-Western, non-white peoples on this planet. So that's the chance, but it's also an obstacle if we don't get this, right? And if we keep being preoccupied looking at Islamophobia as if it was a problem of religion alone, that is not intersected with all of the other forms of injustices. So I think in this aspect, in this regard, it's really I would take it as a chance. Because the other thing is, and I think Zain Abdullah today spoke about this in the way he tried to make sense of the way Muslims try to define themselves within the U.S. context as a race. That's a perfect example, I think, where you see that, like, how people try to survive in an unjust world. And the question at the end of the day, especially when we talk about ecology, also I don't want to go too deep into this, because it opens up again too many questions. But I think here what we can see is that I think humankind at this point of time is at a point where we can ask ourselves a question like, what role do we want to play confronting all of these challenges that we as a human society globally are facing? So to take the positive out of it, right? Yeah. But I'll keep it to this.
Just very brief, I think you've outlined the challenge, which is almost insuperable. What kind of world do we want to have? And with the trends that you've identified and the migration that's already occurred, if the blood and soil populism wins, it's going to be a very violent and ugly place. And we have to take concrete steps to make sure that doesn't happen.
Okay, just one remark, just to say that if we come back to the French situation and we study when the Muslim problem was constructed by the French government first in early 80s, 1980s, not after the attack, the New York attack of 9/11, or long before the attacks that targeted Paris, etc. This Islamophobia constructed by the French state in early 80s is an important time because it was the neoliberal turning point, neoliberal turn by the left, the French left, the Parti Socialiste. And this is an important thing because, the races doesn't blow up like that, without any relation with the job market, with the economics, with the class issues, etc. Racism and class issues are always connected, and it's appear clearly in the French context. And this is important because at this time, back then, it was some racism from population working to the white working class, etc. But it was targeted. It was focused on anti-immigrants, anti-Arabs racism, But in early 80s, this is not population who raised or intellectual who raised this question, but the government, the French government, headed by the Parti Socialiste, the left. I just want to say that I think we forgot a little bit this question of class issues and the competition between the groups forming the working class, and also the competition in the elites, and the competition inside the elite, within the elite, with a new Muslim middle class in Europe who afraid some of the hegemonic group and the white elites in general. And this is something I think that is very strong in the French context, at least.
I don't know if Ivan wanted to say anything.
Thank you. Okay, maybe not. There's a lot I could say in 5 hours, but very little I can say in the few minutes that I think remain. My talk was very specific about Hungary, but I hope that it has some very broad implications regarding different forms of hatred, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. But I think I'd like to go back to where Mustafa Bayoumi started us this morning. And he talked about the loss that specifically white people of a certain kind feel, a loss of culture. They feel they're victims of globalization. And that there is another aspect to this whole story, which is decolonialization. And Farid also mentioned decolonialization, different kinds of studies of Islamophobia, racism studies. I think the racism studies and the decolonialization and this sort of white loss, they're all actually do fit together. The colonial history is a history of racial supremacism. So is slavery. And we find today that Islamophobia is strongest where they're stronger in general, where there are fewer Muslims. And those tend to be areas that are the most white. So sometimes people ask me, do you think Hungarians, or I also study Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Eastern Germans, are these people who are inherently more Islamophobic, more racist? Maybe they didn't have the liberating experience of post-World War Western democracy, so maybe it's something in their culture. And I totally disagree with that. But I do think it's a matter of those areas being very white and not impacted as much by the presence of actual migrants who have turned many of the greatest cities in Western Europe and North America so great. But from the perspective of these people, like I really like Farid's posters about Vienna will not be Istanbul, Vienna will not be Chicago. The idea is Vienna should be Vienna and not one of these terrible examples of, in one case, a different culture, and in the case of Chicago, multiculturalism. So I don't think there's anything that incredibly different. Of course, there are things, but not everything is so different in Eastern Europe. And I like to compare worldwide the peripheral regions of the Western world. And my suggestion is that Islamophobia has taken root there, especially because they were left out and they were impacted more by neoliberal globalism than other parts of the world.
Well, thank you, panel. I really appreciate a fantastic set of presentations. Thank you so much.